Honey, I shrunk the kids.
We're all the size of boogers.
Dad, don't eat me!
Released in April of 2005 on the Game Boy Advance, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap was the first original Zelda game released on a handheld console since Oracle of Ages and Seasons in 2001. Hyrule has been attacked by a mysterious new villain named Vati. Our hero Link teams up with a sassy magical cap known as Ezlo, who can help turn Link into a small version of himself so that he can interact with a tiny race of people known as the Minish. Can Link and Ezlo save Hyrule? Let's find out. Welcome folks, I'm Livid. I've been wanting to cover Zelda games and I decided to play one I've never played before. Way back in 2005, I had a Game Boy Advance, but I never owned the Minish Cap. To be honest, I didn't even have an interest in playing it. Back then, I had become an edgy teenager who started playing Halo with my friends. But the good news is, making content has been helping me get back into them. Let me know if there's any ones you'd like me to play for YouTube. Spoiler warning for major story beats of this game. If you're familiar with the Zelda series, much of this game's setting will sound as usual. It's the Kingdom of Hyrule surrounded by different biomes to explore. You play as Link, who is friends with Princess Zelda. She shows up to your house because she wants you to attend the Picori festival with her. The Picori are actually known as the Minish. The Hylians just call them Picori. They're a tiny race of beings that come from a different world but arrived in Hyrule to aid humans from monsters hundreds of years ago by giving them the Light Force and the Picori Blade. They settle in the Minish Woods but can be found all over Hyrule. Their goal is to simply make humans happy. A sword tournament is held and the winner gets to touch the legendary Picori Blade, which is sealing away the evil monsters from hundreds of years ago. Unfortunately, the winner of this tournament is Vati, who smashed the competition. Once he gets close to the Picori Blade, he destroys it, unleashing all the evil within to spread across Hyrule. After this, Vati turns Princess Zelda to stone and begins his search for the Light Force. Link is then tasked by the king with saving Zelda and the kingdom. The king asks Link to go seek out the Minish Woods because they know how to rebuild the sacred Picori Blade. During Link's journey to the Minish, he encounters Ezlo. When you meet Ezlo, he's being attacked by some enemies and demands help. Immediately after saving him, you get a sense of his attitude, and it's hilarious. Ezlo has absolutely no patience for Link, and I couldn't help but immediately start laughing. Ezlo is always scolding Link and telling him to hurry up, and it's not just the text. The sound effects he makes sound like an old man mixed with a bird. Then his animations are so over the top. I can think of nothing funnier than watching that beak flap around in anger as he's yelling at me. I don't know what it is, but I got a sick satisfaction from Ezlo being mean to me. Ezlo is also interested in tracking down Vati because Vati actually cursed Ezlo. Vati was Ezlo's apprentice at one point. Ezlo created a powerful cap that could basically do anything the user wanted. Vati used the hat to curse Ezlo into a cap form and he ran away. Although reduced to being headwear, Ezlo is still very powerful. He is how Link transforms into a tiny version of himself so that he can interact with the Minish. Link transforming like this is a big gimmick of the game. You don't just become small on screen, but you enter a whole new world that you couldn't see before because you didn't have that tiny perspective. Suddenly simple enemies are the size of massive titans. Shoes become houses. Blades of grass have become big redwood trees in appearance. It really has a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids vibe to it. I'm not sure what you'd call it in a game sense, but I just call it Minish World, although it's the same world technically. You'll need to alternate between normal and Minish World in order to solve puzzles and find items. Once Link tracks down the Minish village, you learn a lot about the 4 sacred elements and how they need to be collected in order to rebuild the Picori Blade. From here, it plays like many other Zelda games. You hunt down the 4 elements, which are scattered across Hyrule in dungeons guarded by bosses. As I said before, if you're familiar with the series, it doesn't take long to start realizing that the Minish Cap is a huge love letter to the series up to 2005. There is good original music, but much of it is familiar music from previous Zelda games that's been redone or remastered. Then there's other audio cues like Vati's laugh sounding exactly like the Happy Mask Salesman from Majora's Mask. There's also returning characters like Malon and Ingo. There's also a lot of references to the Super Mario series with enemies such as Bob-ombs, Spike Beetles, and the ridiculously obvious Lakudus. The general vibe of this game feels like a juiced up version of A Link to the Past with its graphical style, musical references, and gameplay structure. I actually think the graphics look great when you consider it's a Game Boy Advance game. You can clearly see how far they had come from the 90s by adding details and personality to sprites. You easily notice characters from 3D games in this 2D world, which I think is a testament to how well the graphics are done here. Throughout the game, you collect a new item called Kinstone pieces. You get the pieces and find the NPC holding the other half, and it will unlock certain locations or events in-game. They have different rarities and rewards though. Green will usually just unlock locations or enemies that have a lot of rupees. Blue is a little more rare and sometimes unlocks locations for heart pieces. Red are much more rare and unlock new side quests. The gold ones are the rarest because they're mandatory for progressing through the game, so there's only like 8. The annoying part though is finding the NPC with the other half of your Kinstone. It's pretty random, it feels like. Sometimes it's important characters, other times it's completely random NPCs, and if you don't happen to have the other half of their Kinstone, you'll need to make a mental note to eventually check back with them later when you get the new piece. This gets really tedious really quick, but Kinstones aid in the design of the map because almost every inch of Hyrule is used. The more you combine Kinstones and unlock different areas, the more you realize how much the devs actually used all of the real estate available, as more and more locations and side quests are unlocked through using them. I think the dungeons in this game have a really good progression of difficulty. Deepwood Shrine is the first one, and it's really simple, but it should be as a first dungeon. You utilize being Minish size here, which is nice, since that's the game's concept, and it wants you to use it, at least in the beginning. A notable enemy for me was the red pestos, which I thought looked like a cross between a Yanma and a Ninjask from Pokemon. Sorry if you aren't into Pokemon, I just see them everywhere now. The boss of the Deepwood Shrine is a big green choo-choo, which is just a normal choo-choo if you weren't Minish size. I really like this because it showed how much the tables turn when you're Minish size. A normally pathetic enemy that's easily killed is a boss when you're Minish size. Since this is the first dungeon, it makes you fearful of that gap getting larger and larger later on. If an easy enemy could be a boss at this scale, what could a difficult enemy be? It made me excited and scared for the next enemies. The Cave of Flames is the second dungeon, and it was also a really easy one, which made me worry that the rest of the game might be too easy. The boss is Gleerock, and he looks super badass though. The Fortress of Winds immediately alleviate any concerns I had about this game being easy. This dungeon absolutely kicked my ass. This is where you get the mole mitts, which are as cool as they sound. They help you dig through loose dirt. The Fortress of Winds just has so many different levels and doors, so if you're confused on your orientation, you need to backtrack a lot. It gave me that classic Zelda madness where after about an hour of no progress, I had to put the game down and walk away. And of course, within a few minutes of coming back, I figured out where I needed to go. Sometimes you just need a breather. The thing that really minished my cap here was after you beat this dungeon and are expecting the wind element, apparently the wind tribe scoops it up. But Ezlo says you can get it later. What? Get it later? I just got my ass kicked for a few hours in this dungeon. You still get your full heart after beating the boss. And speaking of the boss, Mazal is a great boss. He looks like a cross between Aztec Ruins and Bongo Bongo from Ocarina of Time. It's the first boss where you actually transform between normal and Minish size to defeat him. You attack him until he overheats, and then you turn into Minish size, enter his machinery, and destroy him from within. I really liked how it had you playing between the different sizes here and made the boss fight feel really unique. The next elemental dungeon is the Temple of Droplets. But in order to get there, you need flippers. In order to get the flippers, you have to do an incredibly dumb side quest, which I hated. You go into Hyrule Town and you need to collect 3 missing books from the library. The issue is how cryptic a lot of this was and having to go back and forth between big and small. I'll try to explain. The cryptic parts were things like initiating a conversation with a person or an animal that you'd never guess would actually progress the mission, becoming big again, talking to the same NPC who before wouldn't give you that same dialogue unless you would talk to them as a Minish size, but then suddenly something changes. It was actually the only time in the game that the cryptic stuff felt unfair and not a matter of paying attention to your surroundings and trying things out. What was good about this mission was exploring much of Hyrule Town in the Minish size. You get to see so many things from a new perspective or even buildings that you hadn't been able to enter before. Like one example is going into the loft of one house where a bunch of Minish have created a little living space and you can see the rest of the house down below. That was really cool. Once you finally get the flippers, you can go to the Temple of Droplets. This temple is frozen over. You need to use a series of hatches to open sunlight into the dungeon, which will melt the ice. Now this dungeon I loved. You have to be very careful not to slip off the edges, but the puzzles were great here. My favorite sequence was having to push a lily pad down a waterfall and unlock a series of blockers so that I could ride the lily pad to the end. This is one of those dungeons that felt really satisfying to solve. It wasn't cryptic, but it was tricky. You also needed a bit of timing to avoid sliding too far off in any direction when you were on ice. Before the next official palace, there is the Royal Crypt, which I guess counts as a mini dungeon. I actually liked this area despite it being short. It's just pure masochism. There are false doors or certain buttons that slap you in the face with failure. Unless you had prior knowledge, the crypt will kind of slap you around a bit because you can't avoid it by being careful. There's a part where there's 3 mushroom catapults and only one lets you progress and the others just throw you down a pit, but you can't see where any of them land. It's pretty funny. After the crypt, there's the Palace of Winds. Here, you'll actually get the wind element. But this one kicked my ass too. In this palace, you get a cape item that helps you jump higher or glide to different destinations. The only issue I felt here was that sometimes you may not fully understand how much momentum you do or don't have, and you'll just fall through the map and lose some health. Or, much worse, go down to a previous level and have to walk back up. The enemies are tough and the temple itself is super long. There's even a moment where Ezlo interrupts you simply to complain about how long the dungeon is. I just want to praise Ezlo again. In a game that was getting progressively harder for me, Ezlo just kept me laughing the whole time. Moments like him complaining about the dungeon's length almost precisely when I thought the same thing just breaks up the tone in a good way. But the boss in the Palace of Winds wasn't really that exciting. It was these strange flying stingray things where you have to utilize your sword to create images of yourself and attack simultaneously. As the game goes on, I start to notice more and more emphasis on using the sword to make copies of yourself to solve puzzles. In my research after playing, apparently Minish Cap is a prequel to the Four Swords game, which came out on GameCube and had a heavy emphasis on multiplayer. The reason I bring this up is because it feels like the game design takes a shift about midway through. There is less emphasis on transforming into a Minish and much more on using the sword to copy yourself and solve puzzles. Despite never playing this or Four Swords, I knew they both existed during this time and I had to look it up to find out. I'm not really sure why it happened like this. Minish Cap is actually a prequel, but came out after Four Swords, so it couldn't be like a teaser game or something. This could have been done to create a sense of continuity and set up the story and gameplay in Four Swords since this was a prequel, but I'm not exactly sure. Before anybody gets mad, I'm not saying I didn't like the times I needed to make copies of myself. In fact, I'd argue that it made me more creative than simply switching sizes as Minish. Going into Minish size was more of an aesthetic appeal that I thought was really neat, seeing the same places from a different perspective, but the making copies of yourself thing felt more interactive. After collecting the elements and rebuilding the Picori blade, you have to hunt down Vati to save the princess. Vati actually impersonates the King of Hyrule and corrupts the castle. This final dungeon is exactly what I want from a classic Zelda game. The enemies are tough and the puzzles are tricky, but most importantly, you're using several items from each section of the game. The lantern, cape, bow, bombs. You use items that you've held for a long time, and I like that design because it makes all of your items feel that they have a role to play even at the end. When you eventually encounter Vati, he's talking all sorts of smack about how he's going to take Zelda's light force and become a god. The final confrontation is what a Zelda veteran would expect. Vati has 3 stages which get progressively more difficult. His final stage harkens back to Mazal, where you need to be big and then transform into Minish size again in order to hit his weak spots. The final fight with Vati was tough for me and I died a few times. When Vati is defeated, the realm is saved. Vati's curse is lifted, which means Ezlo returns to his original Minish form. He gifts Zelda the powerful cap he had made, which Vati took. She uses it to cleanse Hyrule from the monsters that were released at the festival. Ezlo returns to his own world where he belongs and he wishes us farewell. I'm gonna miss that guy. We've had companions to Link before across many Zelda games, but Ezlo screaming at me as he's bouncing off my head and flapping his beak is something I grew to love. I feel like I missed out having never played this back when it was released. I think I would have really liked it. Even 20 years ago, I already had nostalgia for things just a few years back in the 90s, and this game is a clear love letter to A Link to the Past. It had a little bit of pacing stumbles, but nothing crazy. I didn't love Kinstones, but they're also mostly optional. I thought the combat and the enemy diversity was really good. The final few dungeons bullied me a lot, which I love, and of course my dear friend Ezlo. When you center your game around the concept of a magical talking hat, you need to knock it out of the park, and they really did. I never had Ezlo spoiled for me, so I couldn't believe it when I first got to know him, and I love the direction they took. I think I will come back to this game in the future, maybe do a 100% run on stream or something, and I would definitely recommend it if you haven't played it before. That's all I had for The Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, it really does help. Follow me on Twitch if you'd like to see me play these games live. I'll be back to full-time streaming very soon. Finally, I have a Patreon. Thank you to my patron, Shio. Patreon will help me make more content, and I love giving you guys extra content like teasers and behind the scenes updates. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.